If you're a guest of this, welcome. I'd like to start with a question this morning, which isn't all that much of a novelty, but it feels like one to me. Stop and think, if you will, of of any place in the Bible, from Genesis to Revelation, that you can think of where God gives somebody an easy job to do. Like He gives them something to do, and it's easy. Takes very little effort, very little cost. Like maybe you could just start at the beginning and talk about Noah, right? Because God says to this guy Noah, hey, this whole human thing has gotten a little out of hand. I think we're going to have to start over with you and your family, and so build a boat, and right, like we've heard the story, build the ark, and it's going to rain. What's rain? We don't know anyway. And it's going to happen, and we're going to start over with you. But just so you know, you're not alone. Just so you know, this isn't about you. It's about me. It's not about your strength. It's about my strength. I'm going to give you a sign that I'm with you. It's called the rainbow. A little bit later, as we try to think of easy jobs, there's this guy Abram. We know him as Abraham. God says to Abram, hey, I'm going to bless you and you'll be a blessing to others. Like all nations will be blessed because I'm going to move through your family, which, by the way, is why we talk about existing for the benefit of our non-members, because it's in our DNA. It's been the calling of God's people from day one. Long before even Jesus, God was calling His people to know Him and be saved by Him and then to pour their lives out for others. So He says to Abram, I want you to leave here, where you're familiar with, and your family and your friends and their security, and go there. Where's there? I don't know. That's the whole point. You're not supposed to know it. Okay. And then He says, but just so that you know that you're not alone, that I'm with you, I'm going to give you a sign. It's called circumcision. And the way this is going to go is, starting with you now, all men in your family, well, they're going to be circumcised. What's that, Mommy? I don't know. You have to ask her. Now, to which Abram says, we gave Noah the rainbow. It's not funny. It's hard to follow the TSA agent. Speaking of things difficult, check out this video. Was just thinking that video is amusing to most of us unless you're paying for a kid to go to college right now. In which case you're going like, dude, that's a lot of money for me to pay you how to throw a frisbee through a hoop, right? Okay, so some levity there, but it's that idea of a difficult calling that I want to get us thinking about, because this morning we're going to begin a new series, and if you're a guest of this, it's a great time to kind of jump into the Narrate culture, because we're starting a new series called Attitude Check. It's going to begin this series. It'll go 5 weeks, where we're just going to talk about what I think is a very difficult calling from God, which involves living with a particular kind of attitude. In Philippians 2:14, Paul said, from prison, do everything without complaining or arguing. And I suspect most of us can agree on the fact that that is an extremely difficult calling. I like to live with a good attitude, a positive attitude, when everything's going well. You know, when we're young, when we're healthy, when business is going well, when the marriage is perfect, when our kids are making good decisions. Like, that's relatively easy. But to live with a certain kind of attitude when none of those things are the case, when we're surrounded by suffering and disappointment and disillusionment and life is very, very real, that's an extremely difficult calling. And so I just feel like God is inviting us to spend the next 5 weeks challenging ourselves in regards to our attitude, our heart in that regard. And I want to be clear, I recognize that there is a way of thinking that I'll call self-delusional, that tells us to just think positive thoughts and kind of stick our head in a hole, right, and believe that everything's going to be hunky-dory. And I don't think that's at all what God calls us to. And yet, there is a type of attitude that God calls us, and I think maybe even invites us, would be a better way to say that. There's a way of living mentally that God invites us to step into that is far from easy and yet extremely life-giving. Now, if you're someone, I feel like a few times a year, last year we did this series called Something About Mary, and there's been others. I feel like a few times a year there's this invitation to lead in a series that comes, I guess, from my own guts and exposes my own weakness and difficulties and trials and frustrations. And this would be one of those, because people who know me and know me well and have known me for a while, or maybe just been to one service, they understand that I have a tendency, I have a propensity to be a critic. I'm that guy who can walk into a room and deconstruct it instantly, right? Like I'm that guy who can see everything that's wrong. I'm that person who gravitates towards complaints, not praises, who gravitates towards that's what was broken, not that's what worked. Anybody relate? You don't have to admit it. I just will for you. We could start like, hi, my name's Adam, and I'm a complainer, which would be a very accurate way to start. My senior year, it was I was thinking about this this year when I got my senior yearbook after I'd graduated and left and mostly won't see those people ever again. I realized that they had voted me most realistic, which at the time I was like, cool, so I'm down to earth. And over the last decade or so, I went like, no, that's not at all what they were saying. Like, that means is critic, like deconstructionist, discouraging, takes the wind out of our sails. That's what that means. And I didn't know that until the summer of 2002. I would have been about 21, maybe 22. I don't know how old I was then. Some of you are doing the math. I'm 32 now, so I don't do math very well. But it was in the summer of 2002. I just finished up a mission trip that I'd led with. I was working for a church. We just started a high school ministry. My friend and boss, who I'd worked for 3 years as an intern when he was a high school pastor prior to that, I worked with him 3 years, and I co-led this mission trip with his best friend, who was very experienced in leading these trips to Tijuana, and he was in his 50s. And when we got back, boss's best friend told boss that Adam's a complainer. He's a critic. He's always pointing out the stuff that's wrong. And that led to a meeting, and that wasn't news to Vern. But in hindsight, he did try to gently point that out to me, and I wasn't receiving it. And it got very firm before the meeting was over, and it became one of those meetings, kind of a watershed meeting, I suppose, where I left, and I was convinced that he was crazy and wrong, and I made all the phone calls to convince the people who I knew would agree with me that he was crazy and wrong. And it took a few days for my wife, in a kind of a very courageous moment, I can still remember where I was standing, for her to say, no, he's right. You're a critic. You're a complainer. You have a propensity to point out what's wrong, not what's right. And certainly I'll be the first to say that I think there's a place for that in God's economy, and yet it can get very twisted and very jaded. And such began for me what has been about a 10-year journey of just working on it. And today I feel like my attitude is mostly good, but not for a lack of a lot of behind-the-scenes disciplines. And what I've realized in these last several months is there's stuff that I do behind the scenes, if you will, that actually feeds a positive attitude, that my default position is not that. In fact, it's taken 10 years to kind of realize the cost of a really bad attitude. And that's really what I want to do in this series, is begin to unpack and explore God's Word and just understand the invitation that is from Him. One of my favorite memories in college, I was an English major, and at that time you majored in English and then you majored in something else and minored in something else because you could teach your minor. And so my major was history and my minor was English, which means I didn't take any grammar classes, which you can all attest to on a regular basis. And my last semester I had to take a class called Senior Portfolio. It was an English class. It was the last class you take as an English major or minor. It's a portfolio, so it's where you're putting together, I think it was 12 different pieces of writing, and it was taught by a guy named Walt Utrosky. Now, Walt Utrosky looked a lot like Vincent van Gogh. He was a professor that I avoided most of my college career. I'd had him once prior to that and actually really, really enjoyed him. But he was this very tall, slender, very austere man. He looked like he was from Kentucky. Oh, no, wait, he was from Kentucky. He wore these circa 1971, like denim suit things, and his beard always was perfect. His hair always perfect. He walked with perfect posture, and he was kind of a robot in the hall, and so I avoided him because I was convinced he would be the most boring teacher in school. But then when I had him, I found him to be incredibly kind and very well-spoken and very slow to speak, and very intentional with every word, but really fun. So I took him for Senior Portfolio, didn't actually have a class, or a choice. And that first day I sat next to my friend Lewis, who, this is the type of friend that you have in college, right? Like the ones that you don't hang out with outside of class, but the ones that when you have a class with them, you look forward to sitting by them, you know what I mean there? And Lewis, we kind of had this fun connection because I was new to following Jesus, and he was raised in the church and wasn't following Jesus, and we had mutual friends that I actually worked with, and so that was kind of a fun connection. And he was very much in the early 20-somethings rebel stage, and he had the whole look and the whole deal, and a very intelligent guy. And so we were sitting down before class, and we were kind of small talking, and the bell hadn't rang yet, and Dr. Utrosky kind of interrupted us. He was sitting not too far from us, and he said, "Hey, Lewis," it was actually like, "Lewis, what did you do this weekend?" To which Lewis said, he looked at his desk, "Nothing." "You had to have done something, Lewis. Did you not even get out of bed this weekend?" "I did nothing." Well, what I didn't know was that Lewis didn't like Dr. Utrosky, and Dr. Utrosky knew that he didn't like him, and he didn't like that he liked him, and he was kind of extending an olive branch. So we had this awkward interaction where you kind of like, "Could I leave?" Bell rang, kind of went about our business, and someone raised their hand and said, "Okay, so how are we going to get our grade in this class?" Which is a reasonable question in a class where, you turn in one thing at the very end of the semester and it's a bunch of seniors who are wondering if they're going to graduate. So, if you can relate, how do you get the grade? Basically what they're asking is the only grade. Is it solely dependent upon that senior portfolio, and thus could I not graduate at the end of the semester but not find out till the end of the semester? With me? Dr. Trusky grabbed his yearbook and he said, well, part of your grade will involve your attitude. To which I'm like, that's weird. We've heard participation, right? We've heard all these different attendance, attitude. Yeah, next to your name, for every date, there's a little box, and every day I will put your attitude in that box. For example, today I am putting PP next to Lewis's name, for his attitude is piss poor. Sorry to use that word, but I needed to use it for effect. Ever considered the cost of a bad attitude? I'd like to challenge you to do that. What is the cost in terms of satisfaction in general? Experiencing joy in general? Because when we're deconstructionists, when our attitudes are poor, when we look at a room and we look at a person or we look at a circumstance and all we can see what's wrong, haven't we effectively destined ourselves to misery? Because is there ever really a perfect situation, ever a perfect circumstance, ever a perfect marriage, ever a perfect job, ever a perfect neighborhood or a perfect car or a perfect house or a perfect church or any of that stuff? If we're deconstructionists to our core, don't we guarantee ourselves that we'll be miserable? Because we essentially create this impossible formula that says joy equals perfection. And if things don't go my way and things don't play to my desires, then I can't be happy. And sometimes we fall into that for a season, like a Bronco season. And sometimes we fall into that for a day or a weekend or a couple hours because we're dehydrated or something like that. But sometimes, and you may be able to relate to this, maybe you have a friend, maybe you are that person, sometimes we can step into that mode for a lifetime. And if you've been there or you know someone that's there, you know it's the most frustrating thing to watch someone who is miserable and no one can do anything about it. Because they're just entrapped, they're ensnared by their own bad attitude. Or have you ever considered the cost relationally? One of the questions that occurred to me this week as I was just thinking this through is, can someone with a bad attitude, can they even enjoy relationships? Because isn't even the relationships that they do have, aren't they centered on criticism and bad attitudes, right? So we get together and we complain about our husbands, or we get together and we complain about our bosses, or we get together and we complain about our wives. And I think one of the tests that we can give ourselves in terms of what our attitude is are we able to have a conversation with another person that isn't talking about another person? Because sometimes what happens is friendships are centered around talking about people, and when we're done talking about people, we don't have anything to talk about anymore. What is it? It's a bad attitude. And the unfortunate, sad cost is you can't enjoy relationships. And the issue is you keep waiting for the perfect friend. And we've all been there. The difference is some of us grow out of it and God helps us see it. And sometimes we become adults who are still looking for the perfect friend, the perfect spouse, the perfect coworker, and they're never going to show up. And thus, we're lonely. Maybe even worse than lonely is we're misery loves company, right? So the only relationships we have are other Debbie Downers. Sorry, I don't have a male equivalent, but I'm not sexist. And all of our relationships just center there. Reading a book right now by Dietrich Bonhoeffer. It's a biography, kind of new out, written by this guy who has done extensive research. And so Dietrich Bonhoeffer, if you're not familiar with him, was this very well-respected theologian from the 20th century. He was a German Lutheran pastor who kind of saw the evil of Hitler long before the evil of Hitler was noticed by the rest of the world and started standing up to him long before the war even started. And it eventually cost him his life. He left America to go lead the German church, knowing that he would arrive in Germany to be arrested, because he just felt compelled to stand up for the gospel there. But early in the book, the author keeps describing Hitler as cynical. Now, I thought I knew what cynical meant, but after the fourth or fifth time that I read him describing Hitler as cynical, especially early in Hitler's leadership, I went what does cynical mean? So I clicked on my Kindle, which is the Advantage, right, the built-in dictionary, and the first definition, maybe you know this, I didn't know this, believing that people are motivated by self-interest, distrustful of human sincerity or integrity. You can see what the author's doing, right? He's saying that Hitler's problem, the way you can understand his policies and his insane use of power, was that he had a bad attitude. He was so others critical that he couldn't trust anyone. And I just had this moment where I went wow, I know where that got Hitler. I don't want to be Hitler, you? I mean, it's like the dumbest question you could ask, right? He had this heart that was so suspicious of others. I think another cost of a bad attitude is an inability to enjoy the now, right? Because the now is never perfect. So I can't enjoy high school, I'll enjoy college, and I can't enjoy college, I'll enjoy my first job, and I can't enjoy my first job, I'll enjoy my second job, and I can't enjoy life until I have a spouse, and I can't enjoy life till I have another spouse, and I can't enjoy life till I have kids, and I can't enjoy life till they leave, right? You see the pattern. I think the last one's fairly reasonable. Just kidding. Problem is, as C.S. Lewis points out in the Screw Tape Letters, the only time that's really real is now. And thus, we're caught up in living in the then and the there, and we don't ever experience joy in the here and the now. And I think, while I'm just trying to get you thinking about the cost, for me, maybe the greatest cost of all is the way it affects the way a person views themselves. Because wouldn't it be true that if I am critical of and have a bad attitude about circumstances and everything around me and everyone around me, isn't that going to hold true for the way I view myself? If I can't look at a situation or a friend or another person without being critical, what's to think that I can do that with regard to myself? And here Jesus actually warned us, right? He says in an oft-quoted verse, "Do not judge, for with the measure you use, it'll be used against you." Well, what is he saying there? Well, there's a few different facets of that. One of them is when you live with a critical spirit, here's the issue. You view people through this lens. The problem is you assume that they view you through the same, I can't do that, but you assume they view you through the same lens. You judge and critique situations and people in a certain way, and the problem is you assume they return the favor. Ever sat down with someone that you were convinced hated you, only to find out, like, no. I worked with Vern for 8 years, and am somewhat ashamed to say that it wasn't until the 6th year that I literally didn't believe that he hated me. I literally believed that any day I could be fired. Because we were so different in our personality and gifts and skills and interests, and we had a good face-to-face relationship, but I always believed that behind the scenes, he was as critical as me as I was of him. And we had this very life-giving moment in the early stages of Narrate when he went like, "You're a moron. I don't think that way about you at all." That's my translation, but that's what happened. Ever been there? We become ensnared believing that people view us, and that's what Jesus warned us. Like, you judge people, and then not only are they going to use that same standard against you, you're going to assume they do, which is maybe even worse. I guess one of the foundations that I would put this series on is the question, what if our attitude is more like a muscle? What if we viewed it like a muscle? Right? Because muscles can be healthy and unhealthy. They can be attractive and unattractive. They can be in good shape and they can be out of shape. And oftentimes, especially as we go through college and stuff, we take these tests, and the tests ask, are you an optimist or a pessimist? And the assumption is it's unavoidable. It's in your DNA. And there's rarely a conversation about, like, what is your family of origin like? And how healthy is your theology? And have you actually done the behind-the-scenes exercises that pessimists either actively or subconsciously do to keep their attitude in shape and healthy? Like, what if you're not destined to see the glass as half empty? What if there's some decisions you can make, some exercises you can do to get that muscle in shape? We don't have to be lonely and others critical and just generally miserable. That's kind of where I want to go in this series, and what we're going to talk about in the next 3 weeks are like, what are those exercises? Because here's the deal with attitude. You can't just grunt your way there, right? You can't just go, good attitude, which is often the way spirituality works. Like we just tell each other, just just grunt and you'll become positive. And I don't believe that for a second. What I do think are there's these exercises, just like with any other muscle, that we can do when the game's not going on, so that when the game is going on, and it matters, and circumstances are challenging, then maybe we can have a good attitude. I mean, what's the condition of your attitude muscle? Chuck Swindoll, a well-respected leader, he said this, the longer I live, the more I realize the impact of attitude on life. Attitude to me is more important than facts. It's more important than the past, the education, the money, the circumstances, than failure, than successes, than what other people think or say or do. It is more important than appearance, giftedness, or skill. It will make or break a company, a church, a home. The remarkable thing is we have a choice every day regarding the attitude we will embrace for that day. We cannot change our past. We cannot change the fact that people will act in a certain way. We cannot change the inevitable. The only thing we can do is play on the one string we do have, and that is our attitude. I'm convinced that life is 10% what happens to me and 90% of how I react to it. And so it is with you. We are in charge of our attitudes. See, I think God invites us into a type of attitude that's not hoity-toity, and it's not based upon naivete, and it's not based upon empty optimism, but it's based upon something much bigger. Bill Walsh, famous football coach for the San Francisco 49ers, who really made his mark by taking these players like Jerry Rice that everybody else passed up and turning them into Hall of Fame athletes. Early in the development of the culture of San Francisco 49ers, when he took over, it said that there was a culture, which is like most other scouting cultures, where he would get a list of prospective players from his scouting department, and the list of the things they couldn't do was always much greater than the list of things that they could. There was these long lists of like, this guy can't do this and this and this and this. Bill Walsh is said to have gotten angry at one point and said, "Stop. I don't want reports on what Jerry Rice can't do. I don't know what he can do. We can build a team on that. We can't build a team on what people can't do." What is that? I would argue that it's no coincidence that the 49ers experienced the success that they did. Wowzers. Because he created a culture of positivity, a culture, a good attitude. Mother Teresa, the famed nun who worked in Calcutta serving some of the least of these, and particularly people with leprosy, she was said to have been asked one time, "What does it take to be qualified to serve with you?" She said, "Hard work, a work ethic, and a joyful attitude." It's counterintuitive that one would find joy serving people who are miserable and taking on a life of poverty. You know, in the Bible, the most reported story, the most recorded story is the Exodus. You've seen the movie, right? Like God, Charlton Heston, the cartoon, Prince of Egypt, like God sends Moses, and he himself joins Moses, and they go into Egypt, and they rescue these people who have been slaves in Egypt for 400 years. He brings them out through a series of miraculous things that are explainable only by God's power. They get into the desert. They're destined for their own country and their own land. This is unimaginable. The victories they're experiencing are insane, and yet what do they almost instantly start to do? Oftentimes the Bible translates it grumble against their leaders, against God's provision, against their future, and they start worrying about what are we going to eat later. What's crazy to me is, like, okay, so these people, they've been rescued, they've had all these miraculous things, they start grumbling, and the grumbling reaches such a high level that it reaches the point where God literally says to them, "I'm done. I can't work with you." Which, isn't that crazy? I mean, we worship, the God of the Bible is a God of extreme grace, who is repeatedly saying, there is no sin, there is no decision, there is no history that keeps you from my grace, because it's not about you, it's about the cross. So God is constantly saying, that doesn't disqualify you, that doesn't disqualify you, that doesn't disqualify you. And yet he says to a group of people, millions of them, some scholars say, who are in the desert following God, he says, sorry, I'm done. So he doesn't say I'm done through any number of different sins, but he does say, I'm done. When a people, what? Develop a bad attitude. In fact, it goes so far as he says to them, okay, here's what's going to happen. We're just going to hit pause on the whole redemption story thing, and we're just going to hang out in the desert. No, that sounds like a blast. It will be a blast. You'll just hang out in the desert, and until you're all dead, until the generation of adults is dead, we're not moving forward. To me, it says it all that a God who works through so much brokenness says to a bunch of people with a bad attitude, no. Paul says it like this in 1 Corinthians, remember our history, friends, and be warned. This is Paul writing to a group of believers in a city called Corinth in the first century. All our ancestors were led by the providential cloud and taken miraculously through the sea. They went through the waters in a baptism like ours as Moses led them from enslaving death to salvation life. They all ate and drank identical food and drink, meals provided daily by God. They drank from the rock, God's fountain for them that stayed with them wherever they were. And the rock was Christ. But just experiencing God's wonder and grace didn't seem to mean much. Most of them were defeated by temptation during the hard times in the desert, and God was not pleased. The same thing could happen to us. We must be on our guard so that we never get caught up in wanting our own way as they did, and we must not turn our religion into a circus as they did. First the people partied, then they threw a dance. We must not be sexually promiscuous. They paid for that, remember, with 23,000 deaths in one way. And we must never try to get Christ to serve us instead of serving him. They tried, and God launched an epidemic of poisonous snakes. We must be careful not to stir up discontent. Discontent destroyed them. Now check this out in the NIV, because I think there's something worth pointing out. Do not be idolaters. One thing Paul's saying not to do, as some of them were. We should not commit sexual immorality, as some of them did. 2 things. We should not test Christ, verse 9. 3 things. And do not grumble, as some of them did. 4 things. You're sending your kid off to college, and you're going to make a short list for him, like, don't do this, it'll ruin your life. Do you put bad attitude on there? Because God creates a 4-part list, a very short list of this will wipe you out, and bad attitudes on it. To me, that says it all. It brings up the conversation of what is sin. You know, the 4-letter word, English language, blah, blah, blah. Like, what is sin, right? Like, is sin something that God just arbitrarily wants to see if we'll listen to him? Like, he's like the bad boss you've had, or maybe the bad parent, who your best interest really isn't at play. He just wants to see if you'll do what he says to do. And that's the whole game. It's arbitrary in nature. Doesn't really matter other than the fact that he's in control and you're not, and he gets to decide what you should do and what you shouldn't do. And if you do what you should, you're in, and if you don't, you're out. Is that the nature of sin? Or is sin, is at its very core destructive? And when God says avoid that, it's not because he's trying to test the degree to which you love him. It's not because he's willing to see if you'll obey him. It's because he wants you to avoid something that'll take you out. And it's interesting to me that there's this story that covers the Bible almost from chapter to chapter called being rescued and experiencing God's grace and then not being a grumbler. And when God lists 4 things, he says, oh yeah, don't grumble. It'll ruin your life. Jude, song by the Beatles, also a book in the Bible, very short book. There's this kind of classic, very, very judgment-driven passage. It says, Enoch, the 7th from Adam, prophesied about them. See, the Lord is coming with thousands upon thousands of his holy ones to judge everyone and to convict all the ungodly of all the ungodly acts they have done in an ungodly way. Some of you are going like, see, that's why I don't read the Bible. Like, what am I supposed to do with that? And all the defiant words ungodly sinners have spoken against them. And he says this. He's just basically said, like, they're toast. And then he says, these people, they're grumblers and fault finders. Like, aren't you expecting, like, they sacrifice their children to pagan gods? That's why they're getting judged. It says, well, their first problem, they grumble and they complain. They follow their own evil desires. They boast about themselves and flatter others for their own advantage. It's intriguing to me that, like, the invitation of Christ is one to life. And very central to the story is, hey, there's a lot of stuff I can do for you. I can forgive you. I can rescue you. I can lead you. I can empower you. But this attitude thing, that one's on you. And if you pick a bad one, it's a big deal. It'll wipe you out. It'll ruin your life. Or to say it in Paul's language, in the book of Philippians, which, by the way, is a book written from prison. So Paul is writing to a church that he hasn't seen in a decade. He's writing to them about joy. If you're looking to do some further reading or don't know where to read in your Bible, Philippians might be a great place to start, because it's this book that's driven by Paul saying, choose joy, and yet Paul's in prison, and it's there that he says, hey guys, don't complain or argue about anything. And 1 Thessalonians 5, I think again picking up on the attitude that he calls us to, he says, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is God's will for you in Christ Jesus. You could spend thousands of dollars in your life trying to get someone to tell you God's will for your life. Paul says it in very plain language. My will is that you would choose a good attitude, because life's about 10% your attitude. 10% what happens to you, and 90% the attitude that you choose to endure. Now, that's not, I want to be sensitive to the fact that some of you picking a good attitude will be a lot harder than it will for me. You're facing stuff and dealing with stuff, marriage and disease and sickness and death and financial crisis that I don't for a second want to trivialize or minimize. And yet the gospel, Paul says, it's bigger. And it's so big and it's so significant that you can find hope even in the midst of the most stark circumstances. So we're going to, over the next few weeks, talk about these exercises that we can do behind the scenes, so to speak. My challenge to you this week is just to spend some time taking an inventory. In fact, my challenge is as you leave this morning, the ushers are going to hand you a small card with Philippians 2:14 on it. It's very, very short. My challenge to us is that you would memorize that and spend some time meditating on it this week. I don't know if that's putting it under your computer at work or turning off the radio as you drive to work or getting up and reading that instead of ESPN.com in the morning. I don't know. But my challenge to you this week, you guys, as we just kind of move forward in this attitude deal, is to just allow God to point some stuff out to you. And maybe he'll point out some specific areas where your attitude stinks. Maybe he'll rescue you and point out to you that you are ruining your life through a bad attitude. Maybe there's a real certain, maybe there's something very embryonic. My challenge to us is, and you don't have to do it. That's why I do this, not counseling, because I never know if you don't do that. I'm just kind of putting it out there. Is just memorize it and meditate on it and allow God to begin to speak. And if you're feeling really courageous, maybe even ask someone that you know loves you. How's my attitude? I mean, are you seeing it go down? Are you seeing it going up? Are you seeing a situation where it's particularly bad or threatening? To me, it seems weird that a church would spend 5 weeks talking about an attitude, but it doesn't seem weird once I open the text and you're reminded that God says, there's a few big sins to avoid. And one of them is a bad attitude. So we're actually going to sing our way out of here. Let me just pray over you, and why don't you just, in the solitude of your chair, maybe before I close, just talk to the Lord about whatever it is you're thinking, or process for a moment whatever it is you're thinking, and then I'll pray and God, I pray that workplaces and homes and marriages and physical health and emotional health and friendships and our very future, God, would change. But because you draw our attention and begin working with us on our attitudes. Thanks, God, that Christ is bigger and that we have hope no matter what the situation because of you and your control. God, we live in a very glass half empty world. We want to honor you and experience the life that you have by shaping our perspective and living with a different cadence, a different mental attitude. We love you, Jesus. It's in your name that we pray. Amen.